Hi everybody, here is part 3 of the Twits. I hope you're enjoying this story. So, can you just take a minute and pause this video and can you recap, can you remember all the things that happened yesterday in the bit we read? Okay, just take a minute and have a think, pause the video if you want. Okay, so there's quite a lot that happened, wasn't there? So we've had the horrible wormy spaghetti, and then Mr. Twit got back at Mrs. Twit by making her walking stick a little bit longer every day for a long time. So she didn't notice it was getting longer until Mr. Twit managed to convince Mrs. Twit she was shrinking. So this chapter is called Mrs. Twit Has the Shrinks. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in your old chair, and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground." Because he'd been changing the chair as well, hadn't he? Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, Mr. Twit was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he'd been with the walking stick. Every night when he'd gone downstairs and stuck a little bit more onto the stick, he'd done the same to Mrs. Twit's chair. "Just look at you sitting in your same old chair," he cried, "and you've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger like a pistol. "You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of shrinks I think I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she started to dribble. But Mr. Twit still remembered all those horrible worms that he'd eaten, and he didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks?" he said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happens?" "Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end, there's nothing left apart from a pair of shoes and some old clothes." "Oh, I can't bear it!" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's a terrible disease," said Mr. Twit. "It's the worst disease in the world." "How long have I got?" cried Mrs. Twit. "How long before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put on a very good thinking face. "At the rate you're going," he said, shaking his head, "I'd say you'd only got 10 or 11 days left." "Is there nothing you can do?" cried Mrs. Twit. "There's only one cure for the shrinks," said Mr. Twit. Tell me, she cried. "Tell me quickly." "We're going to have to hurry," said Mr. Twit. "I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say," cried Mrs. Twit. "You're not going to last long if you don't," said Mr. Twit, giving a horrible, grisly grin. "What is it I must do?" cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her face. "You're going to have to be stretched," said Mr. Twit. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors, where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons. He had fixed an iron ring into the ground. "Stand right there," he said, pointing to the iron ring. He then tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. When that was done, he started filling up the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled up with gas, it pulled the string really tightly. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the string to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some of them he tied round her neck. That's very dangerous. Some he tied under her arms. Some he tied to her wrists, and some he even tied to her hair. Soon there were about 50 different coloured balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you yet?" asked Mr. Twit. I can, cried Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." He put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull was becoming very, very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now, with her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons. She was quite unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to go back inside when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something very silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If those strings break, it's goodbye to me." And that's what gave Mr. Twit an even nastier idea. What do you think he's going to do? Mrs. Twit said something about checking the string is tied up tightly. Wonder what Mr. Twit's evil idea is. Shall we find out? "There's enough pull here to take me up to the moon," cried Mrs. Twit. "Take you to the moon?" exclaimed Mr. Twit. "What a ghastly thought! We wouldn't want anything like that to happen to you. Oh dear me, no." "We most certainly wouldn't," cried Mrs. Twit. "Put some more string round my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe." "Very well, my angel," said Mr. Twit, and with a ghoulish grin and licking his lips, he knelt down at her feet. He took his penknife out of his pocket, and with one quick he cut the string holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She shot up like a rocket. "Help!" she screamed. "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below looking up. "What a pretty sight that is," he said to himself. "How lovely all those balloons look in the sky. And what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last, that nasty old hag is gone forever." Wow, that was pretty mean. I didn't think Mr. Twit was going to do that, but he did. He cut the string and sent Mrs. Twit off into the sky. I wonder what's going to happen next. Can you predict what might happen? We're not very far into the book, so I don't think it ends with Mrs. Twit sailing off into the sky. What could happen next? Are they going to continue to play tricks on each other? Who knows? We'll find out on Monday. So, no stories tomorrow or Sunday as it's the weekend, but I'll be back bright and early on Monday morning and we can see what happens to that nasty old lady, Mrs. Twit. Okay, have a great weekend. You've earned your rest. Bye.